in what I would call pretty much basically managed chaos, or if we want to call it that. So I'm hoping that what I present today is going to be useful to you. I'm going to be forwarding this PowerPoint as well as some resources that can be put on the website, or Cheyenne can go ahead and send those to you should you want them. A little bit of a background. So I was a middle school counselor during the academic years, and then on the summers, I was working in residential facilities for gifted and talented students like Johns Hopkins, Governor's School for the Gifted, and over visual and performing arts. So this was always an area that was of interest to me. The more I counseled and worked with gifted kids, the more I really felt like school counselors who didn't necessarily get any coursework or any training in GT may want to think about, what can I give to them to help round that out if they never got that training. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. Today's presentation is a top 10 list because I just feel like short, sweet, and compacted might be easier. But I do want to let you know that some of the things I'm drawing from are research studies that have been done for some time, and a lot of the information I would say that I'm giving is almost as if it was a digested version of 2 academic semesters. So there's a lot. I teach the Intro to Gifted Ed here at the University of Iowa on alternating summers, specifically for our school counseling students. And I've also taught counseling the gifted. So I'm merging some of these content pieces together. I hope that they are helpful. If I can answer questions, I will. I'm going to try to aim this for about 40 minutes, and then we'll see where we are by 11:40. And if I can answer questions, then I'm happy to do that. I guess just some preface pieces before I dive into that list. No 2 gifted kids are the same. And when I get asked, well, what do I do with this student with this issue? One of the things I really sort of try to caution is, A problem times B student doesn't necessarily equate to C solution. So sometimes we have to get creative. Sometimes we have to think outside the box. Sometimes we just have to really sit and listen to a student, because that may mean, what exactly that they need. One of the things you're probably going to hear me say a lot is just listen, listen, listen. We know from our research in our field that majority of clients, they just want someone to hear them. And that makes all the difference. They don't necessarily want someone to solve their problems, but they want someone to actually just hear them in a very non-judgmental way. And our gifted kids are no different with that. And unfortunately, given all the myriad of things our gifted students are up against, there is no magic bullet, there is no magic wand. We can't make some of these things disappear, but we may be able to help them through listening, and maybe helping them sort through some of the solutions that they could come up with for themselves. Sometimes we just need to support and let them know that we're in their corner. And the other thing I'm going to probably talk about a little bit today too are some counseling paradigms that I found to be really helpful just in understanding how people work. And so you might find some of those useful, not just for working with your gifted kids, but just working and understanding people in general. I can tell you that given everything that's going on in the US right now, I've actually had to go back and think about those models some, and they help sort of ground me in what my expectations are for change and what my expectations are for people changing. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here. So some of the things I'll be getting into, I kind of just, again, structured this with like major concept ideas, and I hope that they're useful to you. Gifted and talented or high ability students can be anyone. They are different. And as a population, they're very, very different from one another, and they're very different from the average or non-gifted population. Some of the things we see in gifted students are some atypical behaviors, and that can cause some questions. And unfortunately, some of those students read it as there's something wrong with me and I need to be fixed, and that's not the case. Human beings in general are complicated, and the change process is complicated. So I want to talk about that a little bit too. I get asked frequently about perfectionism and what that means for gifted students and what people should know about that. It's also a rather complicated topic. It's not nearly as cut and dry as I would like it to be, because that would be a little bit easier, but nothing in life is. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about some ways and different ways of seeing perfectionism, so that might be helpful. I get asked a lot about friendship and what that means for gifted students. And I kind of want to drive home that the idea of what friendship is and what quality friendship is really is in the eye of the beholder. What we would value individually may not be the same thing that our students value. Parents and family members need just as much support as gifted students do themselves. I'll be giving some ideas for that. Giftedness does not stop at grade 12. We know that inherently and logically, but all of our gifted kiddos will grow up to be gifted adults. And so I'm kind of going to add some ideas there for career development pieces, thinking about the fact that, you know, students go on and do things after they graduate, and how can we help them think about those things. Relationships are everything. I think if there's one primary concept I would try to drive home, is that that relationship is so critical for all of our students, and definitely for our gifted students. And part of that relationship really is listening and empathizing. And I think if those two things are in place, a lot of the other additional, what we call work, that the student may need to do to help themselves through some difficult issues can happen based on that firm foundation. Okay. So gifted kids can be anyone. Again, I know you all know this, but this is sort of just a refresher. I think sometimes we come in with our own lenses as educators, and we think that gifted sort of looks like this or should look like this, and really that's not at all the case. Gifted students can come from all cultures, all different environments, all different family structures. They are experiencing the same thing that every human being in the universe experiences. Depending on what's going on in their lives, they could be their family members could be going through a divorce, they could have suffered a loss, they could be grieving, they could be experiencing a breakup of a significant other, they could be moving, they could also be coping with mental health concerns, substance abuse, violence at home, those sorts of things. So again, we don't normally couple the concept of high ability with some of these other factors. And yet I think it's really helpful to keep sort of an open mind and open stance about what giftedness could or should look like. One of my favorite quotes is actually here. The idea that there's no more varied group of young people as diverse as the gifted and talented population. I think that's kind of a useful thing to know. One of the things too is, and I'll get into this a little bit later, is because of this sort of idea, what we tack on to the concepts high ability or gifted or talented, again, we kind of come with our own lenses, and we draw from our own experiences. And when someone says the word high ability or gifted, we may be thinking about a thing or attaching to some concept. And I think to a certain extent that plus media and media portrayals of gifted individuals can kind of create some mythology about what giftedness is, for better or for worse. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that as well. But I think it's really important to kind of unpack that a little for ourselves. Like, what do I expect? What am I thinking when the word gifted arises? What am I thinking when high ability arises? What assumptions am I making about that? And I just think that that's useful in general whenever we're working with any particular population. But in this case with gifted, I think that there's some definitive stigmas that are attached and some definitive opinions. Even the word gifted can have some, can cause tension in a conversation. So I think just acknowledging that and recognizing that we come with our own lens. When we're working with counselors in training, we talk about this a lot. Like when we're thinking about working with clients, what normal lenses are we seeing our clients through? Why have we developed those lenses? How have they come about? And how can we free some of that space up so we can see the clients as they truly are? And I think gifted students being one of those populations, I think that might be helpful. So gifted kids are different, for sure. And that's a good thing. And they are unique. And like I said before, there's no two gifted kids, just like no two other humans are, exactly alike. Some of the things I'm going to be talking about are a little bit broad-based, but I want to first sort of situate some things about giftedness in general and how students are sort of making sense of that based on what we know. A lot of our gifted kids actually have some real confusion about what giftedness means. So when we use the word high ability, and I recognize that, every state and district has different interpretations, they have different identification measures, and that plays a role. So what, giftedness might look like in Nebraska would be different than, say, Indiana versus Virginia. And to a certain extent, I think that also confuses some of our stakeholder groups, including our parents and our students. But in general, it's not just about the definition, it's about what does that mean as an identity piece. And a lot of our students know that they are different and they don't necessarily know why that is. And so this concept of what does this mean, I think a lot of the times that we work with gifted students, part of the conversation in the background is always this piece. Like, what does it mean to you? What is it, you know, when you say you're different, what does that mean? What does that look like? How are you making sense with that? And being empathic while we're working through that. And then how does giftedness intersect with other facets of identity? Because we're not just one thing, we're a host of different things. And then for the school counselor's lens, to a certain extent, although I would argue that this is true for all educators, what does that mean then in terms of a student's academic life, their social and emotional life, and their career and post-secondary plans? Because all of these things feed together in K-12. So how do we understand gifted? There's a lot of different theories out there. There's a lot of concepts out there of talent development, and that would be kind of beyond where I can take us today, because, you know, an intro to gifted education course would cover this for about like 5 or 6 weeks easily. But a lot of the things we know about gifted students come from research, come from case studies and clinical studies from psychologists and psychiatrists, and come from research from different bases, not just necessarily in gifted education, but in psychology, sociology, education in general. So there's a lot of different research components that are feeding in and sort of helping us inform ourselves and our field about what giftedness is. So on top of that, there are different sort of developmental paradigms. And I kind of came at gifted from the back door via counseling, and those are the first paradigms we're actually exposed to, which is looking at human development over time. And then integrating that with things like intelligence theories or creativity theories. But in general, I think some of the most helpful things is to understand gifted students in terms of big concepts or big trait areas. The first few you see here, the precocity, divergent thinking, excitability, and sensitivity, a lot of that came from Torrance's work in the 60s. And I think one of the most powerful pieces I ever read as a beginning educator was actually Deidre Lebecki's work on gifted adults and how these traits manifested. Also in terms of entelechy and perceptiveness. Now I should say entelechy, that's a weird word, right? It's actually Greek. From what I understand, the closest approximate would mean to be goal-driven or goal-oriented. And that can look a little different from student to student, but in general, we're sort of painting a rather broad brush with some of these traits, but some of the things I'm gonna read off may really resonate with you as for working in the classrooms, because you may see this really frequently. So these are the students who generally need less of drill and skill. They can make those connections much more rapidly. They may be a little bit bored with repetition because they've already used that. It becomes a little bit easier for them, and for a good chunk of them, they learn faster and earlier. So that early developmental piece, that early precocity piece is a part of this. Some of them have really advanced insight, not just in terms of concepts and relationships with concepts, but insight into people, that perceptiveness piece, the ability to read subtext with adults, recognizing that there's something going on in the room. They may not be able to label that yet, but they can very much tell when there's tension. Many of them are very responsive to the idea of it depends versus a concrete one way or another way answer. Many of them can entertain the both and concept. For some of them, it's like they are insatiable with their curiosity. They want to know, they want to know, they want to know. They want to dive deep into areas that are very much of interest in them. That may come across in classrooms like the ones who ask a lot of questions all the time because they just want to know, and they want to know why. And they want to know that question now, preferably, and giving the answer as soon as possible. These are some of the students too who like to investigate things, like I said, do a deep dive into their passion areas, things that they're interested in. And, you know, to a certain extent, some of these students have a hard time understanding why other students can't keep up with that pace of ability, because they're making sense of things much quicker and at earlier stages, and they're sort of wondering why everyone else isn't doing the same thing. Some of the other pieces too that might be interesting, or things that you may have seen in your classroom, some of them are very much not happy with their own sense of work. They have a high level of expectation of themselves. It may or may not be coupled with the expectations they're sensing that others have of them. They can be extremely frustrated if there's not a right or precise answer that they're looking for. They can be very intense. They can feel things very intensely. And to a certain extent, you know, these are some of the students who can see the major issues of the world at an earlier age, and they worry about it. So these are maybe the students too that are saying we need to start a recycling club in our school because look at what's happening to our planet. Not only do they see that, they sense it, they feel it very keenly, and they do so at earlier ages. And so there is sort of this appreciation for morality, for fairness, for equity, because I think they can see those things much more clearly and at earlier ages. And that's sort of one of those, you know, you're 7. Why are you worried about this? Well, they see it on the news, they read about it, and all of a sudden it's like, why isn't everyone else worried about this? Because this is an important issue. This is our planet. This is our environment. So that's just an example. The other piece too, I think, and again, this sort of speaks to the earlier and more kind of concept, is this idea of asynchronous development. So normally what we're talking about there is this idea that they're sort of out of step with themselves. And in this case, most of the time, what we mean by that is their ability, their cognitive abilities are vastly outpacing their other ability areas. As an example, especially with the little ones at elementary school level, they can hear, understand, maybe say a piece of music and they want to replicate it on the piano, but they don't have the fine motor skills to execute it. They can see a piece of art and want to be able to replicate, and they can't do that yet. So in some cases, you're seeing a huge divide between what they can see and understand cognitively and then what they can actually do physiologically, because they're, again, 5, 7. I mean, it's just, they're not there yet. And the same thing can in fact be true between the emotional level and the cognitive level, that they're being, you know, a 9-year-old may be able to process 16-year-old concepts, but they're still functioning emotionally as a 9-year-old. And so there is this discrepancy, and that discrepancy can be a source of major frustration and grief. If I'm trying to communicate something to you, but I don't have either the fine motor skills to demonstrate what I'm trying to tell you, it can be excessive. We get frustrated as adults when we can't quite get out what we want to say or what we're trying to communicate. So the students are not that much different, only they're experiencing this earlier. And they don't have our adult coping skills either yet, because they're still developing those. So I think it's one of those things that to keep in mind and try, if possible, to be empathic about, because I think these students, when they're in that rub of not one piece of them not keeping up with the other piece, it can be kind of painful and frustrating. And it's hard to talk about that when you don't even have necessarily the vocabulary yet, to sort of say what you're thinking, what you're experiencing. So, you know, what does this all add up to? I just gave some examples here, and of course, most of my work has been with gifted adolescents, and they're an interesting bunch in and of themselves, because don't we all recall adolescence to one way, shape, or form, and not all of adolescence is particularly pleasant. So you could be seeing any combination of these things. Like, I've read all the biographies on Nelson Mandela, but would you look at the fact that I'm breaking out with acne? So, I mean, there are these very interesting juxtapositions of identity and ability all merging together and mixed together. They may know a lot about one particular area, and that may mean it seems like they, do we talk about things like well-roundedness, or do we really help them develop their passion area? Again, some of these students are very much into trying to rectify the wrongs they see in their environment, in their community, and they want to do something about it. And at the same time, it's like, I can't believe I'm going to school wearing this, and what are other people going to say about me in the imaginary audience? So it's sort of like this weird juxtaposition of advanced ability and cognition, and even, some advanced capacity too when it comes to emotion. Some of our students are able to do that, and yet normal life and normal change and hormones and long arms and long legs and all of the changes that adolescence brings with them. And it's really sometimes hard to help them navigate that. And it's also sometimes hard for us to remember when you're talking to a 16-year-old who sounds like they're 30, it's very easy for us to latch onto that and kind of have to stop and remember that they're still just 16 and what 16 means, because we've all been 16, and that was probably not fun for any of us either to a certain extent. So again, these are maybe some of the things you may be seeing in your classrooms or the students that you're working with. So it's a very unique group. And again, I am painting a very quick brush and a very broad brush. There are plenty of resources out there if you want to get a little bit more acquainted with some of these predominant traits. I will be sending, again, Cheyenne some resources that she can.
No, I just have to listen to a webinar. What's up?
Okay, so bringing this all together, what do we see as counselors, and what are some of the things our gifted kids struggle with? Ironically, when Judy Galbraith did her original research in '85, like looking at gifted kids, and the gifted kids were telling her what they were concerned about, not a lot has changed since then. These are some of the very same things that we're wrestling with now. The concept of feeling different. I think, again, going back to helping students understand what we mean by giftedness, what they mean by giftedness, what that means for their identity and how they're making sense of that, that is still like, I don't want to say it's 50% of the battle, but I would say it's a good chunk of it. Like, we're consistently working and helping students navigate that. And with that lack of understanding from other people, like, why are you so weird? Why do you read all these books? Like, there's something wrong with you. And after a while, those messages are being received and being sort of sifted through, and that can cause some pain. Social skills, again, just like any other kid, our gifted kids kind of run the gamut. Some of them are very socially savvy. Others of them really need some work building those particular skill sets. Fear of failure and fear of success, those are definitely in play. Excuse me. And that can work with, around, and into the concept of perfectionism and expectation. School skills, like the traditional, do they know how to manage time? Do they know how to organize their binder? Do they know how to do some of this? Some of it is, for some students, absolutely simple. They know how to do it and they do it. And other kids, it's like torture. They'd rather be thinking of big concepts and solving big problems and not necessarily worrying about what's in their binder. Underachievement, and I could do an entire day on this kind of concept. I can't. I only have, oh gosh, now I'm down to 20 minutes, so I'm only partway through this. Underachievement is a very multifaceted concept, and if I can, I'll provide some resources for that as well, but I think that's kind of beyond the scope of where I can go with the 1 hour that I've got. Multipotentiality, that is a complex concept as well. There's some differing ideas about that from the research base, but I want to boil it down to some of the common messages our students receive. And that is, well, you're so smart, you can do anything. To a certain extent, that's not really helpful. And so many of these kids can do everything. If you look at some of their profiles, they may be very talented in a lot of different domain areas, which means there's a lot of doors they could walk through. But at the same time, making those decisions when it comes to secondary planning, that's a lot harder, because you can be able to do a lot of different things, but that may not mean that you're necessarily wanting to do them, or that they're meaningful to you. And then existential depression, which I would say links right back to understanding who we are and what giftedness is like, do I matter? Do my contributions matter? Is my life meaningful? And where can I find that meaning? And our gifted students, I think, are looking at this much earlier, at much younger ages. And I think that it's something that they're going to be wrestling with most of their lives. I think we all do, to a certain extent. I mean, even existential counseling and psychology approaches say that this is something that's always happening with us as humans. I think our gifted students, our high ability students, are doing this earlier, even as early as elementary. I remember hearing a story from a gifted parent who said that her child, and I think the child was 5, and the child went to her and said, "Mommy, what is my purpose?" And so I think that's sort of what we're talking about here. That's just one example of that. Which leads us to, no, nothing is wrong with you. You don't need to be fixed. And I think, again, that kind of comes back to what messages are our students hearing, and how are they making sense of them? And again, some of the things that we know about gifted education come from a wide variety of different sources, different areas of research, different types of studies, different types of case analysis, biographies, studies of eminent individuals. But what we're also sensing is that there are these predominant traits that, when they come out, look different. And because of that, there's sort of a reaction of, that's not right, it needs to be fixed, when really we're not saying that any of these traits are pathological at all. There's nothing necessarily wrong with our gifted students. Now, if they are wrestling with mental health concerns, they will need help and support. But some of these traits don't necessarily, mean that there's something wrong with the kid or necessarily wrong with what they're doing. And I'm going to give you an example of that. Actually, I had a slide, but I'm not sure where it went. So one of the things I want to just say as an example, and I think our gifted kids hear this, when they hear there's something wrong with you, it may be explicit messaging, it may be implicit messaging, and I'll give an example. So I was working with a student years ago at one of the residential programs that I was with, and she was a brilliant musician. She loved creating, I guess for all practical purposes, like 5-person quartet, and she could actually script those. And she was working on something. She heard a melody in her head. She wanted to articulate it. And I had gotten a referral from another staff member saying, I'm really kind of concerned the student isn't sleeping. I'm kind of worried about this student. And so we had a lovely chat, and she said, look, I realize I'm burning the candle at both ends, but I need to get this piece of music out. And she needed those, she was going to classes during the day and there were social activities. So the only time she had to work on this was her evenings. And that means she was up until 2 or 3 in the morning. But to her credit, she had a budding masterpiece on her hands. I mean, had written all this score for 5 people, and she needed that time. So on the one hand, from an outside observer, it may look like there's something wrong, that they're not sleeping, that they're always up doing something. On the other hand, for that student, it's generativity, it's creation, and it's something that they needed to do. So long story short, in some ways, we're still balancing these conflicting views. So like on the one hand, if gifted students are different by nature, then they're going to need something special. On the other, they're so brilliant, they're so talented, they're just as well adjusted, they don't need anything extra. And I don't think that life is ever that easy to solve. I don't usually think it's one or the other. It's usually a both and. There are going to be some students who do need specialized education and do need specialized support, and others are going to be fine. I would just suggest that, looking at giftedness as an automatic inoculation for being able to deal with everything that life hands you is a falsehood. All of us need help at any given point. All of us need support. All of us need people to listen. So just because you're talented doesn't mean that you're not dealing with what life hands you. And as a gifted students, they kind of handle life a little differently, a little more intensely. They handle life issues earlier because they're able to grasp them. So those are some things to kind of consider. I think Jean Peterson kind of says it the best, and she's been a mentor of mine for years, and I've been really fortunate to work with her on a couple of different projects. But when you think about it, gifted students are going to be coping with the same developmental challenges every one of us has to. That's just, it's life. We can't get around it. If there was some way of being able to jump from elementary all the way to adulthood without having to deal with adolescence, I think we would all probably opt for that. But because there are giftedness, those characteristics that are associated with giftedness may make the subjective experience of meeting normal challenges a qualitatively different experience. So I just, again, with those different traits all interacting at the same time, I think they're looking at a different journey through these particular developmental challenges that we're all having to work through. So yeah, talent development process isn't smooth. One of my favorite authors, one of the first ones I read was Blackburn and Erickson's article in 1986, and they suggested this concept that along the talent development process, things are going to arise that, pardon me, might be able to be predicted, or at least these are things we think may happen with gifted students. And some of the things they'll be wrestling with would be coming from asynchronous development, their ability to also regulate their affective components based and interacting with those traits we were talking about before, or being a member of an already marginalized population. So any one of those things, or all three working together, are going to mean the talent development process is not going to be smooth. There are going to be additional challenges on top of what normally gifted students would work with in general development. Oh, there's my slide. The slide just wasn't where I thought it was going to be. So yeah, these are some of the things our gifted kids hear, which is because you are different, there's something wrong. And differentness doesn't necessarily inherently mean that that's a bad thing. And so I think I think many of us have heard, I know I have, when I've been talking with gifted students, they'll just simply say something's wrong with me. People keep telling me there's something wrong with me, so I'm here for you to fix me. And that just breaks my heart. yeah, it's just so hard to hear that they think that some of their best traits, what makes them unique, what makes them gifted, are the things that need to be fixed because there's something wrong. And so if you hear that, just sort of flag that in your mind. That may be something that the student really needs someone to listen to about. And I think I pretty much hit that. The next piece, I think, is just super useful. Again, I work with people, not just gifted students, but work with people from all different backgrounds and walks of life. And I train counselors to work with different client populations. So some of the things that we utilize in our counseling arena, I think, is just really helpful to understand gifted students and just people in general. So one thing, and probably none of this is very different than anything you might have thought of. Some of you maybe heard some of this before. So, but if you haven't, maybe this is helpful to you. What we see in others is largely, if we want to think about people as icebergs, we see that tip. We see the top of it. We don't know what's going on underneath. And as we know about icebergs, the biggest part of an iceberg is under the water. So it's the parts we don't see. And that's human beings. Everything that's really going on is normally underneath the surface. And we may be able to see some of it as it rises up into behavior or action or speech, but a lot of times it's just happening underneath all of the time. And this mix of thoughts and feelings and culture and experience and morals and values and all of those things happening underneath. So sometimes our job as educators and listeners is to help students make those connections. You know, when we think about counseling, a lot of times what we're doing is just listening and reflecting back to our clients and saying, so I'm hearing you say that, it seems like this is what's going on. And the client's like, oh yeah, that is exactly what's going on. They just needed someone to reflect it back. And so some of the things that we're doing are helping students make sense of what they're doing versus what's going on under here in this really messy mix of what it's like to be human. So iceberg analogy might be useful to you. Definitely some of the things that are hard to understand when it comes to change. Sometimes it's helpful to understand change paradigms or change models. As counselors, we get inundated with these. Like our very first set of trainings, our first semester of our master's, we get a lot of theory. One of the best theories is actually coming out. Prochaska and DiClemente had a theory of change called the cycle of change, and that's here. And it's probably a little bit harder to read from where you're sitting. So again, you'll have the PowerPoint, but a lot of this is used with substance abuse and addiction work. But in general, change models are pretty utilitarian across the board. And basically the idea is we move in this cycle, whether it's change that's imposed upon us or change that we're opting to instigate for our own lives. And so when I walk through this, normally I talk about things like the bad habits we have that we want to change. As an example, and I think this is funny because my students ask me every now and again, how am I doing with this habit? So one of my bad habits is when I do laundry, I really have a hard time. I can get the clean laundry into my basket, and then it never quite always arrives to my closet or to my chest of drawers. And I know we can all probably think about one or two things that just kind of hang us up on any given day. So if I were going to work through this, these are the things I would have to consider, whether or not I have any intention of changing this. If it's working for me, I may not want to. At the same time, it really gets exasperating when I can't find the one piece of laundry or clothing I want to wear that day because it's somewhere in a basket that I haven't, filed someplace in a drawer or in the closet. So contemplation is when we're aware that there's a problem or an issue that we need to resolve, but we're not quite ready to take action yet. And somewhere between pre-contemplation and contemplation, there's a lot of blame behavior. So I could blame my work life. There's just not enough hours in the day for me to get that stuff from the basket into my closet. We can blame other people. Well, if my boyfriend wouldn't insist on having me watch football with them, I could get a lot more done. So any one of these things, because it's really easy to go there than try to focus on the issue that really does need change. But let's say that we kind of come to that point where we're like, okay, we really need to figure out how to solve this. I realize that whatever problem it is really kind of impacting my ability to function well, or in this case, find the clothes that I want. So preparation is that stage where we start planning. Okay, so here are the things I know I can control. Here are the things I might want to try. And then action, which is actually doing that, which is me on a Sunday night, preferably not waiting till a Sunday night, because let's just be honest, I'm not going to probably do anything on a Sunday night preparing for Monday morning, but probably sometime during Saturday afternoon, which would be preferable. I'd be taking my laundry, doing my laundry earlier for one, and then two, sorting it later on. And so that would be my action phase. Now I could keep that up and hopefully that keeps going every weekend, but something always happens because that's what life does. Life hands us a thing. So all of a sudden I've got something I've got to do on a Saturday. This doesn't get done. And so I might have a relapse, or I might spend several weeks not doing that, you know, shifting from the basket into the closet type of thing. And that's normal. And so, you know, when we think about our own changes as adults and how hard it is, even when we want to make the change and we're invested and we're walking it out, when life happens, it's really easy to get off track with that. Now think about all the changes that we want to see for our students' success and what they, you know, what we're seeing, like, wow, if that student could just take care of this, things would be so much easier for them. And yet they don't even have the range of coping skills. They're still learning how to get those skills in ways that we already have as adults. So anyway, if this is helpful, great thing to have sort of in your back burner is like, oh yeah, so any one person or student could be in any phase of this. And I think it's just really helpful to know that. The last little model that I thought might be helpful is what we call the Johari window. We do this a lot in training because I think it's important to recognize that we all have our blind spots, and so do our students. And so you can see it's broken down into 4 different quadrants, what's known to us versus what's not known. Same thing for what others are aware of and what is not known by other people. And so normally what we're working in is that known to others and not known to self, which is that blind spot. Like, well, I can see this. How come you can't see this about yourself? Ironically, some of our very perceptive students tend to have that same outlook, and they'll say to someone, well, this is a major fault of yours. Why wouldn't you want to fix it? So shouldn't you be happy I'm telling you about this? Because wouldn't you want to fix it? Because I would want to fix it. So I think we all have this. We all have our blind spots. We all have our facades and our masks and what we present to others. So our gifted students, as they develop as humans, they're the same way. And we're helping them get to know some of these areas. And I think there are gentle ways of handling this. And so kind of helping, again, connecting the top of that iceberg to the bottom and helping gifted students sort of understand that. All right, Cheyenne, how do you want me to roll with this? It's 11:40.
If everybody, or if you would just drop in the chat really quickly, if you would prefer to listen to the rest of the presentation or go into question and answer now. All right, go on, go on, Dr. Wood.
You're all awesome. Okay, perfectionism is another big concept area that I get asked a lot about, and I really wish I could say, it looks like this, do this with your student. But it's not nearly that easy, just like humanity isn't easy. And so I'm gonna just talk through a couple of pieces that might be helpful in sort of understanding literally how multifaceted this concept is. So if it's helpful to you, I'm hoping that this might provide some sort of kind of background, like, oh, I didn't realize we could look at perfectionism in these different lenses. So a lot of research has been done on perfectionism, not just in gifted ed, psychology, a lot of different fields, general education. Some of the things I have found helpful in my understanding of it, even in myself. So by the way, I always consider myself to be a recovering perfectionist because I still fall into some very negative habits. And as advanced as I am in my career, I still catch myself doing things that I know does not benefit me at all. And I sometimes have to take that step back and say, okay, where is this coming from? So there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. I really love Spears-Neudemeister's work on perfectionism. She's done quite a bit. I'm citing some of her studies, and I'm also borrowing from other researchers. But the self-orientation of our perfectionism. So this is the high expectations of self, and we do see this in our gifted kids. So this may mean when you see the outbursts or the frustration or the failure, that there's a sort of sense that I have to be able to master this and demonstrate it, and anything less is non-negotiable. In some of these students, we do see family constellations or family orientations that are a little bit, interestingly enough, actually more flexible, like authoritative and less demanding, but yet this seems to be internally driven by the student. Sometimes we don't see that. Sometimes we see very high demanding parents and family members and very authoritarian and seeing this. But so, like, I think what I'm coming back to is it's not as cut and dry as we might think perfectionism is. Then we have some socially prescribed perfectionistic tendencies. So kind of believing that others have this high demand of me and trying to rise to that. And so the idea that I have to perform consistently over and over, not necessarily for myself, but for what others are expecting me to be able to do. Sometimes that trickles down into my office in terms of students saying, I can't tell anyone how much I'm suffering because they expect me to have it all together. And sometimes if you start, digging down into that, there's maybe a certain sense of self-expectation that students are also thinking, I should have this together. There's something wrong with me that I don't. People keep telling me that I'm gifted and I can do anything. So surely I should be able to handle whatever it is that's being thrown at me. So I've heard quite a bit of that too. Another way of kind of looking at it is this idea of positive strivings. So I think I just want to back up a little bit and say two things. What's helpful for me when working with not only my own perfectionism, but working with students when they're wrestling with this, or even adults, is to look at perfectionism as a continuum of behaviors. So let me kind of say this. A lot of times perfectionism gets knocked as a real negative, like all the way around negativity, when if we didn't have perfectionism, we wouldn't have the Sistine Chapel. We wouldn't have some of the great works of art. We wouldn't have a polio vaccine. We wouldn't have some of the breakthroughs in science. So to a certain extent, this is a necessary thing. And I don't think it's always inherently bad. I think that it can be very utilitarian. The point to which it derails positive functioning, it's a different issue. And so we could be anywhere on that continuum at any given point. I notice it in myself because, again, I know I'm unlike an adolescent or an early adult. I've had more time in my body and my own mind and thinking through how I do things. When I catch myself with some of that negative stuff, which is I'm noticing it's 2 a.m. and I'm fussing over a paragraph, I'm like, okay, now it's gotten the better of me. I need to walk away for a little bit. But again, our gifted kiddos are still learning who they are and how they respond to these things. So a lot of times when we're helping them is to actually listen to them and have them unpack where and how these things are happening to them. So I hope that's a little bit helpful. So, kind of looking at it as a continuum. So positive strivings, again, I think without that positive strive component, we're not looking at some of the technological or artistic breakthroughs that we've got. We don't see advancements in society. So I think that is a part of that. And then on the other hand, looking at it in terms of, am I consistently evaluating myself as less than because of? And so that's where that negative piece, I think, can come into play. So it's really much more complex. And we can be anywhere on that. We can have a lot of different ideas of where our locus of control is, like to what extent can I, control my outcome or control myself, or to a certain extent. I think to sometimes we all kind of feel like something is controlling us, like work or whatever it might be. And so again, I think it's where it's prohibiting normal, healthy function is where we need to look at. But again, I'm thinking about that young lady with her musical score for 5 people. I mean, she wants to get it right, but at the same time, she actually had a pretty good idea. She even said, I know to cut myself off after 5 nights of staying up till 2, 3 a.m. because I'm going to crash. And she's 16, so she's got a lot more energy than I do. But it's that sort of, she started to understand where her balance and her line was. And we're still helping our students figure that out. Even as adults, I think we don't necessarily know where some of those lines are when we dive into some negative thoughts or some negative behaviors that are not unhealthy or ineffective for us. So some ideas for that. These are some of the things that I just recommend. Some of this comes from the literature and research base, other things that I've just sort of kind of found along the way. I would also suggest that, and maybe this is just my lens, so I'll acknowledge that right up front. I think that mindfulness to a certain extent is really helpful with this. But some of the things I can tell you I've wrestled with all my life is this top one, separating myself from what I do. And American society loves to link those two things. Like our success, our generativity, what we've accomplished, the doing of ourselves is intertwined with our being. And at some point, you know, how much are we going to really buy into that? Do I really want to believe that the sum of who I am is what I do? And I think our gifted kids are consistently wrestling with this in some way, shape, or form. So I'm not the sum of my mistakes. I'm also not the sum of my accomplishments. I am who I am. And part of our journey as humans is to figure out who that really is and kind of start stripping some of that away. So getting to some of the unspoken thoughts, again, this is where listening is just sort of what we do. Let's help these students kind of unpack some of this. Where is this coming from? What is it like to sense it in our bodies? Because you can feel that tension rising. I know, I very, very upfront, very transparent. I tend to go into counseling about once every 4 years just to keep working through my own stuff. I don't feel like I can be an effective counselor educator without doing that on my own. And I run into this, like, all the time. It's still with me. So I'm still in recovery. But someone helping me to kind of unpack those thoughts are really, really useful. And we wrestle with this. We wrestle with our own coping skills. We wrestle with life and as adults, and yet our students are still learning how to work with some of this. And sometimes it's really not all right. Sometimes there is pain. Humanity, that is sort of, pain is part of the human existence, and we don't necessarily like being in pain. And so we want to stop being in pain, and yet we have to go through it in order to kind of get to that other side of development. So being afraid, being in pain, I think that needs to be normalized and acknowledged and say, this is not a good, bad, it just simply is what it is. I had never heard it is what it is until I got to the Midwest. One of the most best phrases I have ever heard. It is what it is. And you leave the judgment out. It's just, we're going through, and I will be with you as we go through. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can say to a student, I think. And let's be honest, the reward for hard work is very frequently more work, and sometimes other people's work. Because when people see that you rise to that occasion, well, shoot, let's just, kind of give them some more. They've done so well so far. And so there's a certain bar that gets raised again and again and again. And after a while, it's like, why am I playing this game? And how am I thriving with this? And if I'm thriving, is that what I want to thrive on? So when is enough enough? And is this work meaningful? To a certain extent, I think our gifted kids are questioning this much earlier, and because K-12 has missions they have to accomplish with their academic mission and visions, sometimes the work that has to be done is work that has to be done. And every single one of us can say there are parts of our jobs that we don't like to do, but yet we know are necessary. So our students are seeing that earlier, and they're probably questioning it earlier. Like, how is this possibly meaningful? How is it relevant? So if you hear that, that's really not going to be uncommon. And to a certain extent, I think we as humans kind of question that ourselves, no matter what job. We could have the best job in the world, and there's parts of it we still don't like, because there's nothing perfect about humanity. One of the things that I tend to ask, again, this sort of coming from my own counseling paradigm, but how is this, whatever this is, working for you right now, or standing in the way of where you want to be? And sometimes these behaviors, even if they're not effective, are just now habit. And it's hard to break out of that. We ask people to change. To a certain extent, we're asking people to do risk taking. And it's like, we can't always see what's on the other side of that risk. All we know is it feels uncomfortable. It feels risky. There's no sense of certainty. There may not be a guaranteed outcome. And so why are we risking it when it's much easier to stay where we are, even when where we are isn't actually useful or helpful to us? Because that's what we are as humans. We prefer to not go through pain, uncertainty, change, and risk taking. We would prefer to be where we are. Homeostasis is where we always gravitate towards when we think about change. So our students are like that too. Pardon me, my Skype for Business just popped up. Okay, pardon me about that. So kind of wrapping these pieces up, sometimes we're gonna see students who don't want to take risks because they don't have a guaranteed outcome. So you may be seeing students who be really appropriate fits for advanced academic coursework, and they're like, I don't want to go near it because I don't know what that's going to mean for me, and I may fail, or I just may not want to do the work. So there could be a lot of things working in the background that may or may not be related to necessarily to perfectionism. I think it's hard. I think it's hard for all of us to actually enjoy success. One of the things I work with my master's and my doc students on is this, is like when something good happens, celebrate it, because if you don't celebrate it, no one else is going to. And I think we don't necessarily take that time. And a lot of times we can't because of everything that was going on. But even carving out a space to say, I'm going to sit here and enjoy what I've just done. And even if it's 5 minutes, I still think is useful because it helps provide that balance. Not everything in life is just work towards an uncertain end. Preoccupation with the product versus, this is a working draft. And a lot of our gifted students really have difficulty wrapping their minds around what a working draft is. It's like it has to be perfect from the get-go. And to a certain extent, that may cause paralysis. Like if I'm expecting perfection in my very first draft, I may not even start because I can't even see what this might look like in terms of evolution. Self-criticism, competitiveness, critical of others, you may be seeing some of that as well. And I would just suggest a lot of times when we see criticism of others, it is a lot about what's really going on the inside. So again, we're seeing the top of the iceberg, but not necessarily what's pushing all of that up. And normally there's a lot of anger or resentment and pain that needs to be worked through before we can actually tackle some of this. So just kind of, again, what you see is one small piece of what actually is underneath that waterline. Self-acceptance and love is conditional. I think, again, this might be family of origin. There may be some things where I need to deliver a thing or else I'm not loved, or my family expects this of me and I don't get affection or recognition any other way. So if I just keep doing this, I will, hopefully get it. Ironically, as humans too, we tend to keep doing the same thing, expecting we're going to get this thing in return, and that doesn't happen. And yet we're sort of, again, kind of wired in that way that we keep thinking if we keep doing it, we'll keep getting that outcome we expect. When some people are just not able to give what it is we want or in the way that we want that. So I think that, I know for myself, this is something that I wrestle with. And I have to remember that if I'm looking to certain people for praise or reward or recognition, then that is a misplaced perception because they're not going to give that to me. And that's hard to hear and that's hard to work through. So it's definitely as hard, if not harder, for our gifted kids to kind of work through. Lofty goals are long-term things. Lofty goals are not bad. Aspiration is not bad. It's a great thing, but it usually takes long-term planning and real investment. And so it's like, when do those goals become what dictates our actions versus we're the ones actually driving the goals ourselves? Figuring out what's an appropriate standard. I think that has gotten thrown out the window right now. I mean, what do we call a good class? What do we call, good learning right now? We are still kind of building the plane as we're flying it. And I think that one of the reasons why we're hearing so much like practice self-compassion, practice grace, is because we don't even know what our own expectations are anymore. And sometimes it's that vague feeling of it should look like this, but we don't even know what this is anymore. And I think, okay, it is what it is. And then I kind of feel like I've spoken to this, like depending on what the family of origin is, there may be parental expectations, there may not be. It may be very much self-driven, so it could be any combinations of those two things or four things. All right, we've got 5 minutes. Probably should do some Q&A, I'm thinking. What do you think, Cheyenne?
Do you guys have any questions? And for those of you who cannot stay past 12, if we go a little bit over, this is being recorded so you can watch it later. But for those of you who can stick around, feel free. If you guys have questions, continue to drop them in the chat. I know Dr. Wood is giving us a lot of really great information, so I'm going to let you continue.
I just want to say shout out to the bathtub scrubbing. Yeah, I get where that's coming from. For me, it's a different area, and that's not the bathtub, but I 1000%, I get that. And yeah, it's interesting though, right? Because, we have these breakthrough moments where like, oh, this is what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. Why am I doing that way? And we sort of make that breakthrough. And then every now and again, we kind of come back to what was familiar and what we do. And they're like, wait a minute, we've had this breakthrough. Why are we here again? Are we giving it up? Yeah, good. I'm glad to hear that. So yeah, I just think that's a really great example. All right, so a little bit about friendships then. So I do get asked a little bit about that, like what should friendships look like for gifted students? And I think that we kind of have to be careful about what we think friendships should look like for them, because I don't think any one of us would actually want someone telling us what we think, who we should be friends with and how it should look. But I do think there's a couple of different pieces with that. So we have actually the idea of gifted students with others. So that peer piece is a huge section of the research, and it's looked at in very different ways. So I'm going to kind of hit some of the highlights that I thought was helpful. To a certain extent, things to think about is that we build our own self-concept of who we are as a human and who we are in terms of relationship with others by being with others. That's how we start understanding ourselves in relation to. We have to practice it. We got to be with others to know who we are. And, some of the things our gifted students are working through are, if they're being perceived as different, it's going to kind of discourage some of that risk taking and that building of that self-concept in friendships or being in relation to other. If they're feeling like it's always a consistent comparison, me versus these other people, or even comparison within self, like I should be this thing to other people, that may be going on in the background too. Gifted students on the whole do recognize that they are different and that there may be consequences for that differentness in the social arena. Now, is that going to be true for every gifted student everywhere? No. However, the research does suggest that there's a concept that Cross and Coleman talked about, and it was called the just left me. It was this the stigma that was attached to being gifted. And because of this, gifted students started to know how to manage their gifted identity. And Marianne Swiatek has done some research on this too, which I found very interesting. So it kind of goes like this in the logical order. If the student is gifted and perceives that they are being treated differently, they will start managing their identity. And there's a couple of different ways that at least the research suggests that they do that, which is downplaying that they're gifted at all. I'm really not that smart. That A I got in algebra, that was a total fluke. I should never have gotten that. So like the downplaying of the talent or downplaying of the gift. They may find other ways to supplement their gifted identity by like excelling in extracurriculars. So instead of being seen as a quote unquote nerd who's always academically inclined, they're actually going to go do debate or yearbook or a sport or something else that makes them, that people can see that versus seeing the other part of their identity. And they may find friends there as well. And then, maybe say, hey, you know what? I don't want to be popular. I don't need to be popular. Just not my thing. So kind of downplaying even that concept, or simply hiding it. Finding ways of hiding how smart or how talented they are, up to and including asking teachers to put, if the grades are being handed back, and I realize that's old school, a lot of things are being done now completely, well, especially right now, completely computerized. But in the old days, things like, can you put a C on my paper when you give it back to me, but put the real grade someplace else where I can see it? So again, sort of like constructing the social identity of how they wish to be perceived. I think it's also a little bit more difficult for gifted students who are verbally precocious, because that's the first thing people hear. Like, wow, they're talking some, what is that word? And they're using all these fancy highfalutin words. And all of a sudden that marks that student as different simply because of how they speak. And so students learn to manage to a certain extent. Or some students just choose not to play the game. For them, it's an issue of hypocrisy, and they don't want to, that's not something that they want to be a part of. So those are some of the things that are coming out of the research that I thought were useful. Again, I do kind of believe that what constitutes friendships is in the mind of the beholder. All students, but gifted students too, they vary with their desire and their ability to socialize. For some students, 3 solid, valuable peers who are meaningful to them is all they need. Others, they'll have a wide range of friends and acquaintances. They're the ones with 50 million Facebook friends. But at the same time, some of them will, in confidence, tell you things like, yeah, I have a lot of friends, but I don't necessarily trust or want to be myself around those people. So again, there's a balance in quality, quantity, somewhere in between. However, the research does support that the more gifted they are, and if you want to look at that in terms of intelligence level, the more profoundly gifted they are, the much harder it is to find people like themselves. And I think at the end of the day, when we're thinking about what authentic, true friendship is, we want someone who can understand us. Like Pooh and Piglet, right? I mean, I'll just sit with you and be with you, and you don't have to talk. You don't have to entertain me. You don't have to tell me I'm right. We're just going to be together. And I think that we all value those friendships. And I think those are somewhat more difficult for gifted students to actually find. I'm going to put this in the resource list when I send this to Cheyenne, but it's a little bit on the old side now, but there's a really nice article by Merica Gross called Play Partner versus Sheer Shelter. And she sort of talked about the different levels and types of friendships that gifted kids might prefer. And most of them are looking for that sheer shelter, like someone who will listen and be with me and not judge me and not tell me I'm different or weird or whatever. So yeah, so sometimes finding a like-minded peer is a difficult and challenging task, and it can be disappointing and it can be painful. So some of our gifted students are wrestling with that. And so again, it comes back to that individual kiddo. Some may need deeper, some may need more, but I think at the end of the day, we're really looking at how does a student acknowledge trust and acceptance? Now, all of that being said, social media has really sort of changed this. You know, with the anonymity that social media gives us, students can say things, and I think it's really hard right now for gifted students and students in general to find authentic friendships because media changes the way in which we communicate. I know even like in some of my professional listservs, we talk across each other, and all of a sudden a discussion becomes a heated argument because we can't see each other. And even in a Zoom room, I mean, it's not the same as if Cheyenne and I were actually in the same room together. Our quality and our how we converse will be different because I can read certain cues that I can't necessarily read on Zoom. And I know all of you who are teaching online are having this very same experience, not really able to know how our students really are because we're not in the same room with them, and it changes everything. We also know that being a friend on a phone and navigating that is qualitatively different than being in the same room with that person. And some of our students have not even had that experience to a certain extent, like being in a room with another person and having to talk, or be with another person not having to talk in a very authentic manner. That you know, the technology piece has changed a lot of that. And I'm not saying I have any good answer for any of it, but I think it's something just to be aware of, that I think that as humans, we are looking for this. We're looking for this connectivity. We're looking for this meaningful relationship. And to a certain extent, technology is exactly what stands in our way of being able to do that. But I'm just going to leave that there. That's sort of just my 2 cents on that. So in general, let's see. Normally when we think about friendships, we know that friendships are developed based on proximity. They're also based on interest and values. Most gifted kids kind of want to go into the value realm. Like, what do we share in common that we both hold to be true and valuable? Interestingly enough, some of the things that this is being borne out by the research, but I think it's not necessarily as commonly known. Some gifted students may feel like the fact that they are gifted is going to prevent them from asking to be a friend. Either they're, you know, they don't want to be seen as in debt to someone or being weak enough to want an authentic relationship. And so if you're trapped in that box of, well, I can't possibly ask someone if they would hang out with me because I'll be perceived as having less power or being weak or having something wrong with me, then you're not going to go out and do it. So that may be going on in the back of their brains too. On the flip side, some of the students believe they don't have anything to give someone else. And that may be self-worth issues, it may be something else, but like the idea that I'm not worthy to help or I'm not worthy to be a friend, I've got nothing to give in return. And sometimes, you know, it's difficult using, even us as adults have difficult times asking for what we need or articulating it in a way that's non-critical of someone else. So using I statements, being able to ask for what is needed in an appropriate manner, not the "you don't do this for me," because we know that doesn't go very far with adults too. I mean, we can fall into that trap anytime. especially when we're frustrated or not getting necessarily what our needs met. Gifted students, just like all of us, they fear sounding stupid. Like, oh my God, I can't believe I just said that, or I didn't say it the way that I wanted, or I didn't even have the words to say it. They may brush off or not be able to take compliments. That could be, again, some of their own sort of self-worth coming through, or if they're hypercritical of themselves. They may feel unworthy or fearful of looking self-absorbed if they take those compliments too easily. I got to tell you, I got called out on this a lot and still do. Like, why can't you take a compliment? It's because I'm evaluating whether or not that compliment is true for me. And I realize that that's a battle area I have. It's really hard for me to do that because I also hold that compliment in light of what I think I should be doing. So there's that perfectionism again, kind of coming out. And some students don't have the models that they need for peer interactions or good peer interactions. They don't necessarily see any of this modeled at home. There's no chance to necessarily practice it in a safe space. And yeah, sometimes when I work with gifted students, I'm like, okay, well, why don't we role play this? And look at me like, really? You really want me to do this? I'm like, yeah, I think you need the practice. Let's try it out. And then I turn it to, well, what are you the most worried about that someone's going to say to you? And they'll list 10 different things. I'm like, okay, let's work through each of them. What's going to happen if they say this? What's the likelihood they're going to actually say that to you? Because a lot of us, myself included, I have a very full range of conversations that will never, ever actually take place with people. And they've been scripted, well, if this person says this to me, this is how I'm going to react. I think we kind of have all been in that place where we've sort of scripted our own. And our gifted students are probably doing that too. And it's sort of helpful to sort of break that apart. Like, what are you resting that assumption on? Like, what makes you think this is going to be something that actually takes place? I have no problems with wanting to feel prepared, but there is a certain saying that we create our own suffering by sort of constructing these things, like living in the future that may never actually come to pass. And Cheyenne, how much do you want me to go over? I feel like I'm hogging people's time.
You want to go until about 12:15, so
Yeah,
5-7 minutes.
Okay. So families and parents need support just like gifted students do. This is a whole nother arena of research that I think is really, really intriguing. And I think we're just scratching the surface of that dynamic between family, student, family, school, student. So this kind of like interesting triangle of interactions. But in general, what we know from the research regarding parents and family members who come to counseling or want counselors' help with this issue, it's kind of interesting. So the things they're asking for it can be very specific, like I know my student's really bright. Can we get an assessment done? I need to understand what's going on more. So getting that in there. A lot of worry and fear from parents that they're not doing the right thing by their child, that they can't provide the stimulation or the intellectual needs or the books or the museum trips or the art or the music or whatever it might be. And there's a lot of self-doubt with that. Like I'm in self-efficacy, like I'm a bad parent because I can't, or I'm worried that I'm going to, ruin my child because I don't. A lot of times you have to dig down to really hear that because it's coming out in other ways. But that self-efficacy piece is actually is pretty well supported. Things like understanding how gifted placement works, that may be a confusing area for parents as well. And I know many of you handle that already. Like, okay, this is how our district does things. This is what it looks like for our school. And so articulation with that. Community resources, like how do I get my student what they need? And if depending on what sort of resource allocation I have, can I afford that? Can I give that to my child? And again, if I can't, what does that say about me as a parent? Peer relationships are probably something you get asked a lot about. Again, also, like, what if my child doesn't have very many friends? Is there something, again, it's sort of like, if there's something wrong with my child, is there something wrong with me? Am I a bad parent? So you may hear some of that too. A lot of times I think what we're really hearing is fear and pain, and that's coming out in other ways. One of the things we talk about a lot in counseling too is how anger is often a secondary emotion. It's that iceberg. The top of the iceberg we see is anger, but what's actually pushing it up is pain and fear. And so and in our American society, it's very easy to be angry. It's more of a socially accepted behavior. So again, normally there's other stuff, rooting underneath this. Sometimes even parents are working through their own gifted identity issues that have never come through, have never been processed before. And all of a sudden having a gifted child, that's just bringing up a whole host of things that they have never actually had space or time or acknowledgement to work through. Okay. And then just again, I'm not saying this as accusatory or that K-12 is lacking in any way. I'm just sort of reporting out on some of the things that the research has suggested just to keep in mind. So there have been, the relationships between parent and school can look a lot of different ways. Again, I see that sort of on a spectrum. It can be really, really positive and a great working alliance, and it can be also very negative and antagonistic, and it can fall anywhere in between. So I think, again, some family members will turn to us as educators because they don't feel like they can give the student what they need, and they're looking to us to help solve that issue or help solve that problem. And a lot of this, research is kind of saying that not being able to provide that is a very stressful part for parents. Interestingly enough, there was one article I read that was not based in the US, if I recall correctly, it was based in Australia. And it was parents and family members, experiences of being a family member or parent to a gifted student. And it was sort of heart-wrenching because the experiences were some of the following: that they would meet other parents, and the other parents would say, well, you have it lucky. Your kid's gifted. It's going to be real easy for you to raise that kid. You've got it all going on. You don't have any issues, sort of negating that experience altogether. Other things would be not being able to find other parents in the same situation, so no one to connect to, no one to bounce ideas off of. Now, granted, with the internet being what it is, there are lots of support websites that are much more readily available, and blog sites than there used to be. So I think that that's helping a little bit. But if you feel alone and being able to work with the challenge that you have, it's really hard. If you're consistently feeling alienated or misunderstood or don't have anyone that gets where you're coming from, it's 10 times harder to cope with that. So again, these are just some things that, from the readings that I have done, if that's helpful to you. I try to, as an educator, really kind of take that context and recognize that I'm only seeing that top part of the iceberg when I'm working with parents and family. I don't see the entire family constellation. I don't see all the intergenerational patterns. I don't see a lot of that stuff I know that is pushing up the things I am seeing. So I have to acknowledge that there's a both and thing, and try to step back as much as possible, work with compassion, although some of these encounters can be very frustrating. We all know that. Sometimes we talk across each other. Sometimes it gets really hostile. And so, if it's useful, I always say, enlist someone else as an ally. If that's going to help you bridge that communication gap, if that's possible to have, fantastic. Giftedness doesn't that, okay, wait a minute. 1 minute short of 12:15. I caught myself there. All right, Cheyenne, what can I do?
All right, do we have any questions for Dr. Wood? Again, these slides will be shared, even the slides that we didn't quite get to, so the information will still be available to everyone. Thank you so much for participating. And again, a huge thank you to Dr. Wood for taking her time out of her busy schedule to come here and talk with us. I'll be on, and maybe Dr. Wood for a few more minutes if you guys have any questions as you start to trickle out. But other than that, thank you guys so much. And next week at 2 o'clock on Thursday is our next session with Dr. Tim Stambaugh, who will also be talking about giftedness from a mental health counseling perspective.
Thanks everyone for coming out, for taking time when I know you don't have any. Really appreciate that. So you're gifted kids.